And just testing that the hearing people can hear me. Perfect. And this is Jeff. I'm actually going to step out and let Shauna take the show. And this is Barbara. I'm going to go ahead and hide my video. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes before we officially begin. Currently it's 10:28 my time. So we're at Washington State over here. I know other people in the East are at a different time zone, but right now it's 10:28. So we have a couple more minutes. Hey, Dina. I know that there are a few people still trickling in to our Zoom room, so we are going to give them just a few more minutes and then we'll go ahead and begin. Okay, everyone, I think we will go ahead and begin today's session. My name is Shauna Bilyeu, and I am the superintendent at the Washington School for the Deaf. And I am also on the CEASD board. I am thrilled to welcome everyone to our leadership series. We do have a few housekeeping things to take care of. And then I will introduce our presenters for today. We do have a request for the interpreter to hide their video while they're voicing. No problem. So first things first, I do want to make sure that everyone is aware that we have already begun advertising for our CEASD conference, which is happening in person. We're excited about that. And it'll be held in Salt Lake City, April 22nd through the 24th. We are currently looking for presenters. We do have a call for papers out right now. Our theme this year is Imagining the Future. We know that COVID has had a drastic impact on how we handle things in a different way, but we would like to bring this as an opportunity to change some of our strategies and capitalize on this time to have people come with these innovative ideas of how we can just make the changes in our schools, our procedures and process, and just have really good information presented. So we do have a call for papers out. Now, we also have Barbara Raimondo, our Executive Director of CEASD, who just sent out information that you can find online, as well as how to submit a proposal for a call for papers and register for the conference. That registration is now open. We hope to see you all there. Now, today's topic is a very serious one. We've recognized that there is a gap in deaf and hard of hearing leaders throughout our nation. So we are thrilled to welcome our two presenters today. We have Dina Patton and Millicent Musioka. And that is the sign name, am I right there? Okay, great. So to give you a little bit of background of our two presenters, Dina is a doctoral student in the Educational Leadership Program at the University of Southern Florida and the assistant principal for FSDB. And she does have people who are mentoring her, but she's noticed that there are not a lot of mentoring services for leaders within our deaf and hard of hearing field, which she will talk more about that later. Now for Millicent, she is an associate professor in the Department of Deaf Studies and Deaf Education at Lamar University. And she teaches graduate and doctoral level classes. The doctoral program offers only one course on educational administration, and she is the professor for that course. She also mentors new staff and faculty at the university. So welcome to both of you lovely ladies, and thank you for being willing to lead this discussion today. We are looking forward to your presentation. I will go ahead and hide my video and allow you two to take over. Once that is done, then I will come back up on screen and we will do a Q&A before we wrap up. Can everyone see the screen? All right, great. So let me just begin by saying good afternoon. As mentioned earlier, I am Dina Patton. I am not immersed in doctoral work right now. I am running a large school in the Sunshine State here in Florida. So, Millie? Okay, well, as I've already been introduced, I'm going to go ahead and begin our presentation. Now, our interest is in deaf leadership, and that does involve my instructional work here at Lamar University. I teach courses on education administration, as Shauna already said. But when I teach, I also tend to invite school principals, superintendents, and other leaders and administrators to come to my class, because I think it's important that our students have that type of experienced information sharing from those in the field and in the positions, whether that be through K-12 or higher education. Now, over the years, I've noticed that we've had deaf leaders, whether that be in community institutions or educational institutions, but the deaf leaders involved in deaf education since deaf schools first began, so all the way back in kind of 1911, the research has shown that we've had about 24 deaf leaders involved in the initialization of deaf schools. and in the process of trying to get more deaf leaders within school histories. But we've noticed that there's been a heavy emphasis on oral education for deaf and hard of hearing students since that Milan conference. The numbers of deaf leaders in the field have drastically reduced. And that's just not an ideal situation. And having so few deaf leaders in these positions. So we've had some discussions people have shared with me and I've shared with my class in terms of just the training sometimes being inadequate or not as robust. They'll pick a lesson here or a course here, a workshop there, but the training seems to have several gaps and it's not really experientially based. And so hence, there's not a lot of support out there for deaf and hard of hearing people with the goal of becoming leaders in the field. They feel like, where is the mentorship? Where is the support? Who can really chat with me about their experience and provide that wisdom? Where is the role model that I can use for my position and becoming a deaf leader? And that is one of the major challenges. And, the types of experiences can be different. From my experience with ethics in leadership, all of these are similar situations to what others experience. It's very culturally relevant, studying an ethics minor, especially in leadership. Culture really plays a big role in that and has a large impact in promotions, in professional development, and finding appropriate cross-cultural mentorship. And so I really do think that this is a vital issue that Dina and I will discuss today. An interpreter clarification talking about ethnic minorities. So as Millicent just shared with you, kind of delving in a little bit, the goal for this presentation is to really start the dialogue about specifically deaf leadership. What are some common characteristics that we are desiring from leadership? Analyzing the positions and what the training could really benefit individuals. So on the next slide, I believe we are going to go back to Millicent. So as mentioned, I spoke with several deaf leaders and gleaned from their experiences and with my experience being involved in the field. Now, previously, I invite deaf leaders and deaf administrators to come and share their experience during my class times, just so that we can get an understanding of what is going on out there in deaf education and in the role of deaf leadership. So for our research, we determined two methodologies. Now, recently, we wanted to do a literature review and really incorporate that in. But we had to identify our research question first. What did we want to hone in on specifically for this review? We wanted to find concepts, operational definitions of what we felt were missing in the roles and in leadership training. So we really wanted to explore different articles and review those and really incorporate that into the narrative and share that narrative so that we can believe in empowering those within the leadership roles. Now, for us to identify relevant articles, we did an electronic search of several databases, including ERIC, JSTOR, Google Scholar, and so on, looking for key terms. And we decided to limit ourselves to articles that were published between the 1990s to the current time. And identifying articles that were there, for example, one article was an excellent article of leadership related to support within deaf leadership roles. But that was published in 1972. And, with the times having changed over the years, we wanted to make sure that it was a relevant article. So we did limit it to the 1990s to the 2021, found all of these research, searched certain topics, and moved forward from there. Now, the two of us were expecting to find a lot of articles. We thought, there were a lot of deaf leaders in history of deaf education. So we wanted to research those relevant people and relevant topics, but we only found 34 articles, based on Google search and other databases. So a total of 34. We went ahead and assessed those 34, summarized the content, and decided to exclude 3 articles from the research. We excluded them because they mentioned deaf leadership, but it wasn't really related to the entire topic of deaf leadership. It was just a brief reference. And they were talking more about hearing leaders within deaf education, not so much deaf leaders. So it was mentioned within the article. And again, there was another article that was prior to 1990 that was a part of that exclusion. Now, sometimes you don't really get full access to the articles, so we read what we could, but there were about 17 narratives that we reviewed within the articles. 9 were qualitative dissertations, 2 quantitative peer-reviewed, 2 qualitative peer-reviewed. And we noticed that, there were a lot of qualitative articles. And I really think it's important to find those narrative type studies, those qualitative studies, because that really includes the voice of the participants. We can see their explanation of their experiences, what's happening in relation to leadership of deaf education. What is, the guidance for future research and future training? You get that from the narratives. And there was one mixed methods article that we reviewed. All right. So as we began to really delve in and analyze these articles, there were some similar themes in the studies that we read. The first theme that we identified was leadership and culture. Now, as I mentioned from my research work on ethnicity, cultural studies, and minorities, those cultures impact leadership. So my leadership is definitely a different style than Dina's because we were not reared in the same culture. We did not have the same experiences throughout our lives. And so that does lead to different leadership traits. It has an impact. So the two of us really thought over the question of how culture can impact individuals in their leadership styles and in their roles and positions, whether that be deaf culture as well as intersectionality cultures, what other cultures they identify with, and how those things can impact their leadership style, their roles, and how deaf leaders and their cultures experiences internal challenges. We have the hearing majority culture and what that looks like as deaf leaders are experiencing that culture in their own roles. Moving on. Great. So when we started to really delve in, the first word or term that we saw that we also borrowed from ethnic minorities is that, cultural leadership. That term is called bamboo ceiling. That word was coined by a woman named Jane Hen. And so a coined term, what exactly does that mean? So she did a study in regards to Asian culture, Asian American culture. And she noticed that a lot of Asian Americans tended to work within the STEM field in technology, computers, and business. Now, there were several that worked in that field, but she also noticed that within their own field, they were not getting promotions. They were not getting those promotions to leadership roles. They would only have lateral moves. So who became the leaders and who became the supervisors were most of the time white individuals. And so when we think about deaf education and the number of deaf students that we have and deaf teachers that is increasing, but we don't see that increase occurring within the realm of leadership. So who are the leaders in deaf education? Majority of them are hearing. And so it is the same issue that is experienced cross-culturally. Another thing we noticed was most of the participants, the research shared the theme of cultural identity versus public identity. And it was strange for me to read about this. Cultural identity, I understood deaf culture, the identity we hold there, but what is public identity? And it explained that public identity means the individual person is identified as deaf, but what do they want that to look like? What is the visual or visible identity that they want their peers to see? So they have their own internal personal identity, cultural identity, but what they want to present out to others, to peers, is the public identity. And at times those were in conflict with each other. So we want to respect the public identity that needs to happen, but at the same time value the cultural identity. And when those are in conflict, that's difficult. So having deaf mentors within the leadership realm, seeing the professional development and growth, and having that cultural integrity. So that's the next term. Cultural integrity means that I accept myself, my culture, my choices to keep my culture despite any perceived or inherent conflicts. So I respect my culture and identify myself, who I am, to help me navigate the conflicts or the challenges of public identity. I don't want to sacrifice my own personal or cultural identity in order to have what is perceived as an accurate public identity. And that tends to happen in a lot of the leadership roles for deaf and hard of hearing individuals. It's identified as still being a struggle. How do we navigate? How do we switch between the cultural identity and the public identity and still respect our own personal choices? And I think it's very vital for deaf leaders to have that opportunity to come together and have a narrative information sharing, going through our own experiences of successes, of challenges, and sharing with others so that we have this mutual understanding of what's going on, whether that be in cultural diversity and deaf leaderships. We want to make sure that we're not just monocultural, that we have cultural diversity in our leadership. Moving on. Now, the second theme was related to leadership and networking. Most of the studies identified 4 components of networking within leadership: interaction, relationships, systems building, and partnerships. Now, with interaction, we've noticed that interaction is more of controlling that relationship. It delves into attitude, personality traits, situational differences that, you have a contract. You may have a contract with your school, with your organization. And it all kind of ties into how you interact with each other and relate to each other within the deaf community or within the school organization that you work for. There are, groups that you would say. And it's that type of grouping that can interact the interaction, that can influence the interaction and relationships. Relationships also can include issues such as guidance. Who is the leader? Who is the follower? The research showed that a lot of situations you had the leader and the follower, and that relationship was based more not on deaf identity, but outside of that. A lot of participants responded to experiencing stress, oppression, discrimination, autism. And it was interesting that with the leaders and the followers and that relationship, also some studies showed that there was some discord in the discourse. There was some oppression where deaf people even oppressed other deaf people. And it was interesting that networking in itself is a challenging issue because of that oppression. There were some deaf individuals that felt like, consent didn't happen. The networking really impacted what my contract with this organization was, or what my, perceived contract with that other person was. So when reading through these articles, most of the studies focused on deaf partnerships and the issue of empowerment. In most situations, the hearing people had the power. They made the decisions. They determined how to apply those decisions, not only for the school or the institution, but for the research that happened, for the data collection that happened. So how can we empower others to really focus on the research and the data that they wanted to collect? It was the leadership wasn't really clearly identified in some of those not as strong research studies. So as Dr. Millicent mentioned, leadership and deaf leadership is a very narrow field, but I really do want to delve into the lit review so that you can become available of some of the terms used within those articles, whether that was a dissertation or a peer-reviewed article. There are only 2 case studies that focused on individual leadership. Now, in this case, there was a woman named Cindy Greenspun, and she worked at a university in the library system. And the article was written by Judy, and I'm sorry, the interpreter missed the last name. And it focused on I. King Jordan, who was the superintendent of Gallaudet University, the president of Gallaudet University. Now, focusing on I. King Jordan, and Greenspun, the focus was more on her journey. There was more gleaned about leadership characteristics and trait in regard to that case study, but the other article about Dr. Jordan really analyzed his own leadership style and found that it would be labeled as transformational. That was his style. There were other few articles related to leadership style, but I really wanted to go back to a 1993 article to increase our understanding and awareness of how we can find the similarities and the consistency between what happened then and what's happening now. There was one study that focused on leadership styles, and the author found that a democratic style was far ahead within deaf leadership. Now, democratic then turned into an autocratic style if needed. And that seemed to be the popular view and approach. Now, there were some variations between past articles and current time. Now, back in 1994, there was an article written by Patty Singleton, and she mentioned that majority of leaders, when they did their analysis, deaf and hard of hearing leaders had an profile, an EJIC profile. And so what they were able to do is compare that to other articles written, and they found that the styles were different. So when going under the Myers-Briggs, such as that e-profile, that Myers-Briggs, it showed that judging seemed to be a pattern for deaf individuals that are task focused, are decision makers, let's say. Another interesting pattern we found, but in all honesty, not as surprising as you would think. Now, as Dr. Misioka mentioned earlier, she talked about empowerment. Now, majority of deaf leaders function around that theme, that topic of empowerment. In fact, one article specifically listed that a function around empowerment was about 75% of the deaf leaders. And that's a large percentage. Now, advocacy took second place at 50%. That article really delved into the percentages. And that article was written by Lampkin. Now, I do want to go back and talk about some other components. Through all of the articles we read, there wasn't a lot of recent ones. The last one was dated back in 2020. And there were several isolated articles that were not supported further. There was no expansion, no disagreement to an article or support of an article. And it talked about superintendents of deaf schools, superintendents that also run the public school system. And they noticed and found that there were a difference in the practices between superintendents of deaf schools and of public schools. But that was dated back in 1997. So some of the information, again, is a little bit further back in time. Now, the fourth theme focused on leadership development, the trainings and the needs. Now, in terms of leadership development, we noticed that there are kind of two categories. You have the adult and then the young, the youth category. And then, of course, you have deaf and hearing organizations. So for an example, a hearing organization, there was one article that talked about how churches could develop more deaf leadership in their organizations. This article was written by H. Lewis. And this specifically honed in on identifying hearing individuals' unconscious bias that took place. And then the second is just the obstacles that deaf individuals can face in assessing the church members and the leadership within the membership body. So for a deaf church to use like an approach, an ecosystem approach, or a shared approach. So you have the adult, and then now going into youth leadership, it focused on kind of childhood development, which tied into becoming a leader for their adult timeframe. And they talked about language acquisition, early exposure to deaf peers. And this article really honed in on that. And there was another article that supported the first article's stance. One of the articles was written by Kay and Stevens. And it talked about just having a safe space for deaf youth to grow into leadership roles. But in order to do that, there needs to be a change within instructional design, really implementing leadership, having experimental instruction and discussion to foster leadership within the K through 12 environment. So a third article came up, and they really all tied together from the first and the second articles. And it showed that leaders really bolstered. I'm sorry, Dina is kind of freezing for the interpreter a little bit. So leadership development. I'm sorry to interrupt. Talking about leadership development and wanting to give them opportunities for growth into the leadership role. There's not a lot of deaf mentorship, deaf, hard of hearing leaders and mentors within the community. So related to adult leadership development, one woman named Jill Smith, she herself wrote a dissertation, not a published article, but a dissertation about deaf community and leadership there. And she talked about ascribed deaf community and how to really earn that and get that ascribed leadership within the deaf community. Having that ideal deaf leadership development and practices and training in order to really invest in that, needing to focus on the training and the needs for deaf leaders to develop that growth. And again, Dina is pausing, is choppy for the interpreter. Interpreter struggling with Dina because freezing. So mainly we're talking about how we can prepare deaf and hard of hearing leaders, or deaf and hard of hearing youth and adults to take those leadership roles. Talking about how to develop new staff recruitment strategies. Having deaf and hearing bicultural leaders. Training these leaders and interaction and working with individuals that have different ideologies, meaning different identities or labels. Training people that work with CIs, cochlear implants, and other amplification devices, as well as those that are oral within the deaf and hard of hearing community. So we're having a shift in our demographics within our population, and we need to develop those trainings to fit that shift. And this is Jeff. Dina, can you see me? I'm not sure. Okay. Her video is hidden. So your video is freezing for some people, Dina. The interpreter was struggling to follow some of your comments. And so, Kat, do you mind showing your video? I'm sorry, there were some on that last part of the articles and how to prepare that. Okay, so the slides, I was able to catch the slides, yes. Okay. So did we capture all of the information in this particular slide? Did you need me to review anything? Where did I stop at in slide 11? It was mixed. Okay, I have the transcript here. Did you just need me to explain all of theme number 4? So interpreter caught the main point. There were some specifics. So about Greenspun, yes, okay. All right, well, I'm gonna go ahead and let Dr. Musioka talk about this slide then, since that'll help. Okay. With all of the studies that we reviewed, we noticed that the theme of leadership, language, and communication showed up frequently. Language and communication choices. It's very important. Communication is so vital in leadership roles. Being able to express opinions, thoughts, to understand the expressive or receptive language that's being used amongst your peers and your staff. And that communication is a two-way street. individuals have to have a multi-point conversation, being able to discuss issues and have that clear communication. Because deaf leaders may not have that full training due to some of the gaps that have been identified. So therefore, they haven't had that full opportunity as well to practice this. Now, TOM and leadership. This is from a past study talking about language acquisition, early exposure to language. And so if you see that TOM, it means theory of mind. And it really does impact deaf individuals within leadership roles and deaf individuals in general, because sometimes they don't have that exposure to TOM. And the research shows that there is a correlation with TOM and leadership. Now, TOM has a relationship with popularity. It has a relationship with isolation, as well as disposition. So it means that if a deaf individual experiences impactful language and early exposure to that, then they have impacted the theory of mind, which has that correlation to leadership. And one study focused on how it impacted deaf youth to begin that development with a strong theory of mind, that strong skill. You know, most deaf students, as we all know, come from hearing families and have that challenge of language delays, language barriers. And sometimes that does impact the theory of mind. There's false beliefs that come into play because of that early language exposure deficit. So theory of mind and all of this does play a part in development. Another thing is working with interpreters. An interpreter is an important component of communication with deaf leaders. It really focused on the importance of deaf leaders to really be clear, have that explicit, understood communication. Interpreters use various strategies to make sure that they are communicating and providing that language access and having that shared relationship by working with the interpreter. There was one study done by Taylor in 2013. And that study was very interesting, related to working with interpreters and deaf leadership. And it really did compare what deaf leaders valued, what they considered priority and what was important when it came to communication, and then what interpreters valued and thought was important in communication. Comparing those two groups, deaf leaders and interpreters, both groups valued clear communication. Both groups valued mutual respect. But it was interesting. We found in this review that these two groups, being very different, deaf leaders valued honesty. They valued that openness and honesty, and they also valued support. So it said that they valued and preferred interpreters that were allies or supportive of the deaf community, allies and supportive of deaf culture, that supported the deaf individuals that they worked with. Interpreters, in the differences, valued open-mindedness. It stated that they felt that individuals needed to have an open frame of mind, open opinions, to be innovative, using different systems to support communication. So it was interesting of the similarities and differences when they compared those two groups of deaf leaders and the interpreters that work with them, the values that they held, for development of programs focusing on deaf leadership, needing to know what deaf leaders value when it comes to language and communication, when it comes to working with interpreters. It's a vital aspect of what we need to understand. And there was several different reports, sort of case by case on the environment in which they worked in. Some deaf leaders in a certain environment valued ASL, but in higher education, there was emphasis on English. And other business type environments, nonprofit organizations, involving the majority population, again, kind of focused on English. And so there were, varying choices of what communication mode was preferred. There were some deaf leaders that grew up deaf children in a deaf family. They valued ASL a little more based on their experience in childhood and growing up, and the language they were exposed to really impacted what they preferred as their language or communication value. And so those are some things that we just have to remain aware of in terms of language preferences and communication preferences and styles, and how to have that switching of our communication modes. And it's going to be individually based, environmentally based. The space that you are in. If you are within a strong hearing community, it's going to change your communication mode or preference. With a school that is valued ASL or bilingual exposure, then we teach them to advocate for themselves to include bilingual leaders. Not just, organizations that focus on monolinguistic approaches. We want to make sure that we are bilingual or multilingual in our approach and integration of communication. Now, the sixth theme talked about intersectionality and deaf leadership. Now, any article that we read related to social justice, related to diversity, inclusion, that term of intersectionality seemed to show up. Now, this came to be a part of language in 1991. But it was interesting kind of trying to find the history and the concept behind intersectionality. And what that is all of the multiple identities that an individual holds. We each have multiple identities. Some may lead to oppressive experiences. Some may lead to discrimination. Some impact the individual, whether they are a leader or not. Now, when we really reviewed these studies and we found a theme of intersectionality, we really wanted to think about that. There was one study in 1995 by Singleton, and that study focused on the intersectionality of deaf leaders, focused on a deaf woman in administration. Within that study, they discussed the history of school leadership, which tends to be women. Deaf education tends to be a more female-dominated field. And still, we're seeing more administrators who are male. It seems that women seem to be working in the teaching field and at that level, but are not promoted to the role of leadership, is what this study outlined. And Singleton did that study, like I mentioned, in 1995, and only found at that time 4 women in leadership roles. The other articles that mentioned intersectionality focused on ethnicity, whether that be Native American, Indigenous, African American, white, and all of those, focusing on their shared narrative, especially for those that were Indigenous peoples, and how those two, as an Indigenous woman, how that narrative and that experience impacted the opportunity that was presented to them, and then how they addressed the issue of resiliency in their experiences, how they coped with the situations and challenges that they had to navigate through in a field where it was more male dominated. Now, it was interesting because they found that the intersectionality focused on deafness and on race. Now, within this study that was done by Moore, that was done in 2011, and they found that deaf leaders also experienced issues of that came into play due to race, disability, and gender. Now, they couldn't really tell which of those three was the oppressive factor. Was it all three? They were intersectional, right? So it became a big challenge. And the entire study emphasized the importance of leadership to recognize the dominant principles and beliefs that they were using that forced out the minority. The majority really needed to focus on those dominant principles and beliefs, identify them. Again, those beliefs and those principles supported more of the majority in the population. So identifying some of those things can help understand how to include and how to empower those minority populations within leadership roles. The legalities, the rules, the principles, whether it was an institute of higher education or a K through 12, they needed to be aware. It needed to be included in handbooks to have these policies and procedures. Or whether it was within the federal government, they needed to know what type of protective laws were out there, what laws and regulations you could use to advocate for yourself. Identify those oppressive biases and the oppression that could happen based on the multiple identities that an individual holds. And then how can we deal with that oppressive experience that comes into play? Especially within professional organizations, deaf leaders joining professional organizations, a professional organization such as, a Black Deaf Association. There are associations out there for Black deaf individuals. And then the Latino population, they have their own professional organizations, as well as an organization like CEASD. Any of these professional organizations providing opportunities for leaders to identify what some of these biases are, what the situations are, and provide that support, that advocacy, that mentoring. There is a big issue right now in terms of mentors or role models and cross-cultural models, cross-cultural mentors. You think about, yes, you may have a mentor, but does that mentor have a similar identity to you? Are you getting that diverse information sharing? If you don't share the same experience, then sometimes it's hard to have a mentor that can validate the story. When I explain a situation or explain my feelings of oppression in a situation, at times I'm diminished by someone who is not of a similar identity. They'll say, "Oh, really?" And they'll diminish my experience based on that. And so sometimes that difference can impact my professional growth and development as a leader. Okay, hello everyone. I'm hoping to get as much as I can before my video starts becoming choppy again. But talking about leadership development and training, if there is information that is missed, then I am more than willing to share as much as I can and answer any questions that you have. Hopefully we'll have some fun as we continue on. Now in this slide, you have the opportunity to think about what is out there. So the two of us, Dr. Musioka and I, want to provide an opportunity for you to really just mull this over and to brainstorm through a Padlet activity that we have set up. In that Padlet, you'll be able to click on a link in the chat. You can either click on the link or copy and paste it into your own web browser. And there are questions related to your challenges and then any solutions that you may have. But give us the opportunity to maybe reach out to you for further clarification, to provide more information and delve into the research that we have done. But I do want to take an opportunity, about 5 minutes for this activity. So ready, set, go. Okay, and again, if you could click on the link that was posted in the chat window, it should be there for you. It should be probably all the way up at the top. Or if you want to just look at the slide right now, you can just type that into your own web browser. And this is Shauna. Hey, Dina, can you see me? Oh, there it is. Okay, never mind. Okay, we got it. I see it in the chat. Perfect. Okay, thank you for retyping that into the chat. Okay, hopefully you have been able to use that link and participate in the Padlet. Okay, I do see one response already. Okay. All right. I am going to let you continue to submit that information onto the Padlet. The link is live. So I want you to just really think about your responses and take your time in sharing those about your challenges and any recommendations you may have. In terms of the challenges, I want you to talk about potential recommendations or resolutions to those. Now, we've noticed that some of the comments are related more to respect, communication, common issues that were mentioned in several of the articles we reviewed during our study. So with this next slide, the information you submitted really ties into what you watched today during this lit review summation. And as recognized, there is a gap between those who have been published or who have already published their dissertations and are doctoral students. There were several good pieces of work that were available for the review. However, many were discontinued before publication within their programs. So Dr. Musioka and I felt very puzzled by this and more concerned by the gap that we've noticed. And several of the dissertations we reviewed, there was a lot of rich information carried over. And we are aware that using dissertations as part of a lit review is controversial. But a lot of people are thinking doctoral students are just now beginning to get into the foray of publications. However, many doctoral students already have several years of experience built in to their research topic of choice. So that is something to take into consideration. With all of the dissertations, they have to do the research and then defend it in front of a committee. So that work is deeply scrutinized. And once it is published, you can believe that there is some valid, proven content within that dissertation. More and more doctoral students are starting to publish before even finishing their program. So having said that, we are still unsure why many doctoral students do not follow through and pursue publication of their dissertations. And so there is a gap focused on the skills within deaf leadership and the need for the training and practices. There's a lot of underlying communications happening, a lot of personalities, a lot of skills, transference, building on that is needed. We need more articles discussing those topics. The two of us recognize something that we wanted to share, and it's the main topic we want to talk about. We feel that research is the crucial aspect to solidify, consolidate, and make sure that all of these individuals, these organizations and institutions have what they need to grow, to build and develop. And that's going to come through avenues such as deaf mentorship, deaf role models within deaf leadership positions. Next. Okay, so thinking about the future, we feel like it still can be a very bright future. We can catch up with the needs within the deaf leadership community. We do need more research. We've noticed that most of the individuals doing research, it takes time. There's a lot of dissertations of deaf leaders. However, what goes beyond that? Where is that follow-up and where is that transition into the training and practices that need to take place? We have 34 deaf leaders right now, but with more research and more studies that are being done, repeated studies to see if what was found is valid. Having that research to truly understand and design leadership programs. And all of that needs to be data-based, research-based. We also need, universities, higher institutions to set up these leadership programs within the deaf field. Or in general, in deaf education, we've noticed that most people who have those leadership roles, licenses, certifications from deaf education or special education. But what can we do to partner with general education institutions and bring in that collaboration with special education or general education degrees and programs that are offered out there that deaf leaders can then take advantage of? We also need more professional development workshops. There are a lot of leaders out here, or people who are aspiring to become leaders, but there's no training that they can take. They'd have to go back and get a degree. They may have certification courses or going to professional development that may be opportunities presented by CEASD or other organizations that can support, but we need to make it more robust. We need to grow that. Also, what does the leadership mentoring program look like? Technically, I can find a mentor anywhere. I'm currently in Texas, but my mentor lives in the Washington, D.C. area. With technology, we have that opportunity to have our information sharing sessions so I can throw out my experiences, my challenges, and get some of that wisdom. But we do have some cross-cultural, but we have the same experiences. We are deaf Black women. We are both immigrants. And so I feel like mentorship is one of the vital aspects for me. And whatever you do within your leadership role, whatever vision you hold, if you are a leader, you will always need a mentor. So we need to really visualize how we can set up a mentor database or some centralized location where we can have that list of available mentors. What is available now for deaf individuals? Who are the deaf leaders in the field that can be supportive role models for those aspiring to be a leader? I believe that is it. Okay, so I'm going to give the floor back to our moderator for a Q&A session. I do see some questions in the chat, so I was holding off until the end, but we'll go ahead and begin our Q&A. Okay, do you mind stopping your screen share? Okay, there we go. Perfect. Thank you. And both of you ladies did an excellent job summarizing a lot of information. Very impressive, and we do thank you. I would like to open up the floor for some questions that we could potentially answer. Now, I do see that Denise had a couple of questions in the chat earlier. One was related to who was the author of that article related to leadership and childhood development? Melissa? Yes, so that study that focused on youth, middle childhood, it was written by and published by Peterson. I'm sorry, last name Peterson, O'Reilly, and Wellman. So those were the three authors. And they published an article, an experiment on child psychology that focused on how deaf and hearing children develop with peers, with leadership within that middle childhood time frame. We found that interesting because many times we think about theory of mind and language, but we don't necessarily think in regards to theory of mind can really bring that opportunity for deaf youth to become leaders. and how it leads into the leadership potential. Okay, well, another question. Individuals, you can please feel free to show yourself on screen and ask your questions if we have any. The floor is yours. And this is Dina. I noticed one question related to the leadership programs that are currently out there. One mentioned there's San Diego University, kind of in the California area. And you're right, back in the day you had a program at CSUN, CSUN. We also have Gallaudet Leadership Institute, GLI, which has changed to become the Bernstein Center for Excellence and Innovation. Now that new center, really they haven't, I guess, they haven't disseminated the program just yet. There is a doctoral program for deaf leadership, and I'm looking forward to when that does come out there, but that is currently in the pipeline coming down the road. There are 2 private mentoring consulting firms. One, I believe, is called 360, and it is led by, what is the last name of that individual? I completely blanked. She used to be a director of admissions at Gallaudet, and then she set up her own program called 360. The other program I'm very familiar with is in Vine, and it is run by Feldman. And these are 2 private consulting firms related to mentorships if you're looking for school leadership roles and mentoring in that field. Now, the second consulting firm I mentioned will help with programming in schools, recruitment of new superintendents in the leadership role. They can also provide 3 to 4 months worth of kind of side-by-side consulting and mentoring to increase the skills that are needed and necessary to build confidence and to become an efficient leader for the school in which you were hired. So if you look at these, I know there are many out there, but I'm sure they have LinkedIn accounts. So if you wanted to see what workshops are offered, there are many leadership workshops, I mean, a plethora of them. So please feel free to delve into that. But within that number of workshops, and I'm talking, it's not just, in the hundreds and whatnot, it's many workshops. There are only about 4 that are for the deaf education field or deaf leadership, maybe 4 or 5. I would say less than a handful. So that's a challenge. And as I mentioned earlier, I think it's very important to focus on research first, gather that data for good data decision making, finding out what our needs are. And then as Dr. Musioka mentioned, having those studies, the replicate studies that validate the significance of the needs, and then having that support from previous research that was finding or the disagreement between findings and having that discussion first. I believe that is the key first step that we can then start building upon, building those programs for deaf mentors, building programs related to training. So that's a really good question. Now, CEASD does recognize that those 2 firms are very critical supports. They are leaders in our field. The CEASD set up a leadership program before COVID came into play, and that did impact. Unfortunately, we had to take a hiatus from it. However, it is back. So I think people can look for more information soon regarding CEASD's Leadership Academy. The goal is to bring that back in March. So starting up again in the spring. And that really is, twofold. It's for new leaders, our new principals aspiring to become administrators or leaders within the school. So it's almost like a 2-3 day immersive camp having great dialogue and discussion, learning opportunities, and then there's an ongoing check-in with their supporting mentor. And so we do recognize that this is a serious problem and it can be very cyclical. And, unfortunately, there's suffering going on because of that, because we don't have enough leaders within our field. And we all know that this is such a critical component, just like Dr. Musioka talked about. Being in this role, guiding schools, guiding discussions and decisions. You can't have a successful place of growth if you don't have the people who have walked in those shoes. So I loved your message about cultural identity versus public identity, and sometimes the conflict between those two. And I think that that's why we see individuals that are not able to really thrive like they could. And it becomes very lonely. Let me tell you that. It can be a very lonely experience. Our schools are so widespread throughout the nation, whether it's a mainstream program, a deaf hard of hearing program, or a deaf school. We are all across the country. We don't have the numbers that can really support us like public schools do, or public districts. And so wanting to support our kids in setting these things up. Yes. Now, I know today our presentation really focused on deaf leadership only. However, my field of study is leadership with those that hold disabilities, such as maybe even in the deaf-blind community. So research that I've done, I've only found one thing related to deaf-blind leadership. There's only one study out there, and that study focused on trying to train young adults who were deaf-blind on issues of advocacy, legalities, protective legalities. And it was really only in the Washington, D.C. area that the training happened. And then an article was written and published, and that was it. But in terms of the diversity within the deaf-blind community, and the leadership roles that are held there, that community is one that is growing and becoming more visible now more than ever. And seeing the similarity of the needs in that deaf-blind leadership community. And so it really kind of delves into just another area of research that we need to be mulling over. In addition to what Shauna mentioned, something came to mind. When we allow those hearing administrators and colleagues within the public school district system, when we look at those, they have these shared information sessions. So principals, assistant principals sometimes, they stay at one school maybe 2, 3, 4 years, and then they move to another school. So they have these rotations. And that's the advantage of being local. That is one of the disadvantages we face is, as Shauna mentioned, we are widespread. Washington, D.C. is far from Florida and far from Texas. So those rotations can't happen. And so how can we therefore increase opportunity for practice, for experience? Now that we have the technology of Zoom, that's something that could come into play and further our ability to work with each other. And as you also mentioned, it's a lonely job at times. And I've experienced this years ago. I knew I needed a mentor during my tenure, and I was fortunate that I was able to find one. And then through my years in administration, I was able to add other mentors, and they were so valued to me. One focuses more on kind of similarity to the FSDB system. Another one helped me focus with my doctoral studies. Another mentor I had focused more in just deaf education leadership in general. And so I was able to really tap into multiple resources through these 3 mentors. And I realized that is something that we need. And it needs to be a consistent, ongoing issue. Do we have mentors? Can we be a mentor? Do you have the time for that, the investment that it requires? I think it's an important question for all of us to ask ourselves and also ask each other. Many of us looking out here, we had, 60, 65, 59. We have many leaders in this field, as you can see by the participant numbers here today. How can we support each other? How can we keep each other accountable to keep growing and supporting each other in this field? So it's a really good rhetorical question that we all need to ask ourselves. You're right, Dina. I do agree with you. And ironically, sometimes it's the thing that we need the most that we don't save our time for. We are so inundated within our schedules, with meetings, with appointments. We're rushing to do everything on our plate. However, we have to carve out time for that conversation with other professionals and colleagues, other mentors, so that we can feed our soul. Because if we don't have that, then burnout can be extensive, and then we can't do our jobs. And so I think many of us are just on the go, Energizer Bunny as much as we can be, but we have to carve out that time to find that individual that can be that support system. It is a huge challenge, but it is a recognized need. And I think we are at the optimal time for that. All right. Well, thank you so much, ladies. We do have a few minutes left. So please, everyone, grab your opportunity. Come on screen and ask a question. I do want to say thank you so much. It was great to be here with all of you today. Please be in contact with us. We will contact you, and I may even ask you to come to one of my classes to share your experience in the deaf field. I wasn't a principal or an administrator, but I think that we should value those administrators and principals when they share their experiences. So I've had 6 people come from K through 12 programs, come to my class and share their experiences, their challenges, and that helps me to revise my curriculum as well. It helps me to realize current events within the field and how I can best support my students in their work and their growth. So thank you all for what you've done and for coming to today's session. And hopefully thank you for coming to my class during the semester, if I ask. All right. Thank you all. Thank you both. We really appreciated you coming. Enjoyed your presentation today. All right. Well, everyone have a great Thanksgiving next week. Oh my gosh, next week. Next Thursday, there is not going to be a Zoom session. I believe our next one will be December 2nd, that Thursday. That'll be our next CEASD leadership Zoom. All right, thank you very much. If everyone wants to pop on screen and say bye, feel free to do that.